All right. Well, Bill Gates is a twice convicted predatory monopolist in the area of intellectual property. So it makes sense that his solution to a problem would be to increase and expand more intellectual property that comes under the rubric of those laws that is a known economic fallacy and drainer of economies, not value added to economies. Let's move on to the land grab that's going on in many nations, including Saudi Arabia and China, and many hedge funds, including George Soros, are buying land in Africa. I take it this is just more of the same, Thomas Mountain.
Well, there is some international companies and governments coming into Ethiopia and buying up some of the prime agricultural land. Of course, millions and tens of millions of people in Ethiopia are literally starving or on the verge of starvation. And yet some of the prime agricultural land is being sold or leased for 99 years to countries like Saudi Arabia, which exports something like 10,000 tons of rice from Ethiopia last year, while millions of Ethiopians are literally starving to death. So, I mean, of course, several $1 million every one of these deals gets put into Meles Zenawi's London bank accounts. But, that's a pretty good example of how, when you get a gangster like Meles Zenawi in power, he doesn't care what happens to his own people.
Right. Is this? Let's talk about China for a second. Is it a positive or a negative, their influence going on there?
Well, I think China's actually overall been quite positive. I'll give you an example. In Sudan, Sudan is the largest and potentially richest country in Africa. And the West really wants to see, United States in particular, wants to see Sudan divided because northern Sudan is under the leadership of Bashir, who they claim is a genocidal killer, when the facts on the ground is that the Darfur relief effort is one of the largest, best-run relief efforts in history, and that without the support and leadership of Bashir, it would not have been successful. So actually, there never was a genocide in Sudan. Of course,
wait a minute. There was never a genocide in Sudan. Explain that a little bit more. I mean, this could be news to George Clooney and some celebrities in Los Angeles. What do you mean there has never been a genocide in Sudan? Explore that a little bit.
Well, I was one of the first Westerners to write about the problems in Sudan in 2003. The problems in Darfur were mainly a civil war that took place mainly in 2004 and some part of 2005. And maybe 30,000 people died. Now, that's a big tragedy. But the relief effort started then, and international forces, along with the Sudan security forces, came in and pretty much stopped all the violence by 2006. Okay, so maybe 30,000 people died in Sudan. That was way back in 2004, 2005. And since then, the people of Darfur who victims of this violence have been the recipients of one of the largest, best-run relief efforts in history. And the UN people and the aid people on the ground in Sudan will tell you that this very successful relief effort would not have been possible without the cooperation and support of President Bashir and his government. Okay, so there hasn't been a genocide in Sudan. Instead, the genocide, which you, Max, were the first international news program to cover, is the genocide in the Ogaden, which, by the way, Max, puts you on the edge, because the real genocide is being funded by the West in the Ogaden in Ethiopia. It never happened in Sudan. That was all a big scam to brainwash everybody to say, hey, we need to send troops in there to protect the genocide victims so the West can come in and take over the largest and potentially wealthiest country in Africa.
All right, we've got about a minute left. Following up on this note that we broke the story on the edge, is there one thing that the mainstream media is not covering right now that we can break for our global audience here today?
Well, like I just was talking about this breakthrough in malaria and malaria mortality prevention in Eritrea. That's a big story. But the Ogaden genocide is starting to accelerate. When you broke the story earlier this year, it was a low-level genocide. Now it's accelerating with the development where they're starting to put together these starvation camps, or they're rounding up the Ogaden people into these camps. They have kicked all the Western aid agencies out of the Ogaden. Meles Zenawi has, including Doctors Without Borders and the Red Cross. And now they're rounding the people up, and they're basically going to starve them to death in these camps. And we're talking about 10, 12, maybe 15 million potential victims. and this is all being paid for by the Western tax dollars. So, I mean, I think this Ogaden genocide is probably the biggest news story that's starting to accelerate and that the West is not talking about, and it was first broken here on your program, Max.
All right, Thomas C. Mountain, thanks so much for being once again on the edge.
And thank you, Max.
And that's all the time we have today for On the Edge. I want to thank my guest, Thomas C. Mountain. If you'd like to send me an email, please do so at ontheedge@presstv.com. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.